Calvin Reeves was 37 years old the night his wife packed 2 suitcases, set her key on the kitchen counter, and told him she didn't need him anymore. She said it the way people say things they have rehearsed in the car. Calm, measured, like the words had been sanded down over many private weeks until every rough edge was gone, and what remained was smooth and final and meant to close a door. He stood in the hallway of the house he had built with his own hands, not a figure of speech, literally built. Every corner, every wall, every load-bearing decision made by a man who understood what held things up, and he watched her carry those suitcases to a car that was not the one they had shared and drive away into a Thursday night in Memphis, Tennessee. What Simone had told him for 3 years, in small ways and then in large ones, was that Calvin was not enough. Not ambitious enough, not exciting enough, not the kind of man her friends admired. What she had never said, what she never thought to wonder about, was why the house they lived in was registered in a holding company she had never been asked to sign. She had no idea what she was walking away from. She had no idea that the man she called boring had been quietly, methodically building something she couldn't see, $740,000 worth of something, spread across 4 properties in 2 cities, structured through a real estate investment company that had been turning a profit for 6 years and whose books she had never once asked to review. What happened over the next 3 months would bring her back to that door. She would not be prepared for what was waiting on the other side of it. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The Tuesday before she left, the light in the workshop came in low and amber through the single west-facing window, the way it did in late October, and Calvin Reeves was at his bench, pressing a plane along the edge of a white oak panel he had been working since the weekend. He was a finished carpenter by trade, which meant he was, among other things, a man who understood that the last 10% of any job was what people actually saw. The rough work was necessary. The framing, the structure, the subsurface preparation, all of it mattered. But what people touched, what they stood back and looked at and formed an opinion from, was the finish. Calvin had been doing finish carpentry in residential and commercial construction in Memphis and Nashville for 15 years. He had a crew of 4. He had a reputation for being the person you called when someone else had made a mess of a beautiful material. His grandfather, Elmore Reeves, had put a handplane in Calvin's grip when Calvin was 9 years old and said, "Boy, the wood already knows what it wants to be. Your job is just to get out of its way." Elmore had died 8 years ago in a veteran's home in Tupelo. Calvin kept his grandfather's first-hand plane on a shelf above the workbench, not as a display piece, not because he was sentimental in the way people performed sentimentality, but because it was still the straightest shooting tool he owned, and some mornings he still reached for it first. Simone had been in the house that Tuesday evening. He could hear her on the phone in the bedroom, the particular quality of her laugh that meant she was performing for whoever was listening. It was a laugh he had learned to recognize over the past 2 years, brighter than her real one, faster, a half-step too eager. He noted it the way he noted everything, without commentary, without confrontation, the way a carpenter notes a wall that isn't plumb. You don't argue with the wall. You measure it and account for it. She had come through the workshop door once that evening, said she was going to dinner with her friend Lacey, and left. Her friend Lacey, as Calvin had come to understand over the prior 4 months, was not always Lacey. He set the plane down and looked at the oak panel. The grain was clear and straight and honest. Outside, her car pulled out of the driveway. He went back to work. He had a job to finish, and there was a doorbell camera he'd installed above the garage the previous spring, and the footage from the past 16 weeks was saved to a cloud server he checked once, quietly, on a Tuesday morning in September, when Simone was at her sister's house in Germantown, and he had 2 hours of uninterrupted quiet. That morning had told him everything a measuring tape could confirm. He had not said a word since. He had simply started building something else. It began, as most revelations do, not with something large, but with something small. A receipt. He had found it in the pocket of her car coat in August. Folded once. A restaurant on Beale Street. Dinner for 2. A Wednesday she had told him she worked late. $47. A glass of wine. An entree. A shared appetizer. A dessert. The kind of dinner 2 people have when they are not in a hurry to leave. He did not say anything. He photographed the receipt on his phone and placed it back in the pocket and went inside and made dinner and asked her how her day was and listened to her answer. He was good at listening. He always had been. His grandfather had told him once that the most dangerous thing a man could be was patient, because patient men had time on their side and impatient ones didn't, and time was the only resource that could not be borrowed or manufactured or transferred from one account to another. Over the following 6 weeks, Calvin built a record. He cross-referenced the doorbell camera footage with the dates on the stories she told him. 14 discrepancies in 6 weeks. 14 evenings whose stated locations did not match the time she left and the time she returned. The mileage variations he noted quietly by checking the odometer against the distances she claimed. He was not a detective. He was a Finnish carpenter. But Finnish carpentry had taught him that what was visible on the surface was always the product of decisions made underneath. And if the surface didn't add up, you started at the subfloor. The man's name was Derek. He drove a white BMW 4 Series. He had a social media profile that was public and populated with photographs of himself at events and restaurants. A real estate agent with a personal brand built around the phrase, "living your best life," whose production numbers, when Calvin looked them up through the state licensing board, were modest despite the lifestyle on display. A man who performed wealth rather than built it. Calvin noted this without judgment. Some people worked that way. It just meant the math didn't hold. And in Calvin's experience, math that didn't hold eventually fell. His hands were steady throughout. He moved with the same deliberate calm that had defined every job he had ever taken. The calm of a man who knows that rushing a finish ruins everything that came before it. He downloaded the camera footage to an external drive. He printed the odometer records he had photographed over 6 weeks. He compiled the receipts, 3 more of which he found over the following weeks in the console of her car on mornings she had gone inside without it. He built a folder on his laptop and named it, simply, Foundation. Then, he made 2 phone calls. The first was to a woman named Dolores Bright. The second was to his Uncle Raymond. Dolores Bright had been practicing family law in Shelby County for 31 years. She was compact and unhurried, and had a way of reading documents that made the room feel smaller, like all the available air was being redirected toward comprehension. She operated out of a second-floor office on Union Avenue, with a view of the street and a reputation among opposing counsel that could be summarized in a single phrase: she did not lose paperwork. Calvin sat across from her on a Wednesday morning with a manila folder and a portable drive, and told her the shape of things without emotion, the way he would have explained a structural problem on a job site. Here is what I observed. Here is what I documented. Here is the timeline. Here is what I believe is coming. Dolores read through the printed records without speaking. When she reached the property documents, the holding company registration, the 4 properties, the 6 years of returns, she set her glasses down and looked at him over the desk. "Your wife has never been a named party in any of these assets," she said. "No," Calvin said. "She was never involved in the investment business. She knew I had rental income." "She didn't ask questions about the structure. Did she ever ask to be included?" Calvin thought about this honestly. She stopped asking questions about money about 3 years ago, he said. Around the time she stopped being interested in the parts of my life that weren't visible. Dolores was quiet for a moment. That's actually relevant, she said. In a state where marital waste and dissipation are factors in equitable distribution, documented patterns of disengagement matter. She tapped the folder. The discrepancy record you've built here is thorough. I want you to keep adding to it. Every date, every discrepancy, every mileage notation. Don't confront her. Don't change your behavior. Just keep building the record. That's what I intended, Calvin said. She gave him a single nod that meant she understood exactly what kind of client she was looking at. Then we're in good shape, she said. As he left, she said one thing that he wrote down in the truck before he drove away. A man who prepares properly never has to explain himself. The documents do it for him. Uncle Raymond lived in a craftsman house in the Cooper Young neighborhood that he had owned for 22 years and refinished himself twice, which was the reason Calvin had always felt at home there. Raymond Reeves was 64 years old, retired from 20 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, and had known Simone from the week Calvin brought her home a decade ago. He had said, at the time, that she had a way of looking at a room that suggested she was still deciding whether it was good enough. Calvin had defended her then. He understood now that Raymond had simply described what he saw. Raymond poured 2 glasses of sweet tea and did not ask Calvin to explain why he had come. I figured something was moving, Raymond said. You've had that look for a few months. The look you get when you're working a problem you haven't solved yet, but you know the solution is coming. The solution is coming, Calvin said. What does she know? Nothing. Raymond nodded. He turned his glass slowly. Your grandfather used to say there were 2 kinds of men who built things. The kind who needed people to see them building, and the kind who just needed the thing to be built. He looked at Calvin. You were always the second kind. That's not a weakness. That's an architecture. They sat with that for a while. Then Raymond said, whatever she thinks she's walking toward, I promise you, it's not what she thinks it is. Men like that, like what you've described, they don't build things. They borrow from whatever is in arm's reach. When the reach runs out, they find the next thing. He set his glass down. She's going to find that out herself. You won't have to say a word. Calvin drove home that evening and made dinner. Simone came in at 7:30, said she'd been at the gym, kissed his cheek, and asked if he wanted to watch something. He said sure. He sat beside her on the couch and watched television and said nothing, and felt the precision of the thing he was building settle into place like a panel finally flush with its frame. He went to bed that night and slept without difficulty. Real power operated in quiet rooms, and Calvin Reeves had been quiet for a very long time. She left on a Thursday. 2 suitcases, her jewelry box, the framed photograph from their trip to New Orleans in year 3, which she took and he did not comment on. She said she needed space to figure out what she actually wanted from her life. She said she cared about him, but she wasn't in love with him. She said she hoped they could be mature about the divorce. She said she didn't need him. He said, I understand. Nothing else. He closed the door. He stood in the hallway for approximately 30 seconds. Then he went to the workshop, sat at the bench, and opened his laptop. He called Dolores Bright at 9 the next morning. He said, she's gone. File when you're ready. I've been ready, Dolores said. What Simone's attorney received 3 weeks later, in a request for financial disclosure as required under Tennessee divorce proceedings, was a document package that her attorney, a general practice lawyer named Hoskins, who handled mostly contract disputes and had taken Simone's case as a favor, was not equipped to interpret quickly. It described a holding company established in 2017, 4 residential and mixed-use properties across Memphis and Nashville. 6 years of tax returns showing rental income and capital improvements. A current combined appraised value of $740,000. None of it was marital property. All of it had been established, funded, and operated prior to the methods of dissipation Dolores had documented. All of it was clean. Hoskins requested a 2-week extension to review the materials. Dolores granted it and said nothing further. During those 2 weeks, Calvin learned through a mutual acquaintance that Derek's BMW had been repossessed. He had not made 3 consecutive payments. His office lease in East Memphis had also lapsed. The landlord had filed for recovery. The personal brand built around living your best life had been operating, it turned out, on a deficit that a regional credit union was now formally interested in recovering. Calvin registered this information without satisfaction. He had known the math wouldn't hold. Math never lied if you were patient enough to wait for it. The meeting was in Dolores's office on a Monday in December, 10 weeks after Simone had left. Simone arrived with Hoskins. She wore the charcoal coat she had bought the previous winter, the one she wore when she wanted to feel composed. Calvin arrived 5 minutes early. He wore his work clothes, clean Dickies, a flannel, work boots he had resoled twice because they were broken in perfectly, and there was no reason to replace something that still did its job. He did not dress for an impression. He had never needed to. Dolores laid the documents on the conference table in a sequence that Calvin had reviewed twice. The financial disclosure, the property records, the 6 years of returns, the documented discrepancy record, the timeline of the 14 evenings cross referenced against stated locations, the 3 receipts, the camera footage summary. Hoskins reviewed the stack for 11 minutes without speaking. Simone looked at the property numbers for a long time. Something moved across her face that Calvin recognized because he had been watching her face for 10 years. The particular shift that happened when she understood, fully, the shape of a thing she had miscalculated. Not surprise exactly. More like the moment you step onto a surface, expecting it to be soft, and it is not. These properties, Hoskins said carefully, they were established prior to the marriage? The company was established prior to the marriage, Dolores said. The properties were acquired over the course of the marriage using revenue from the company's operations and capital from a separate investment account held solely in my client's name. Full documentation of sourcing is in tab 4. Hoskins turned to tab 4. Simone looked at Calvin for the first time since they had sat down. He looked back at her without hostility, without satisfaction, without anything that could have been read as gloating. He just looked at her the way he looked at a piece of work, assessing, clear, finished. She started to say something. Then she stopped. There's nothing here for her to claim, Hoskins said quietly, more to himself than to anyone. That's correct, Dolores said. Simone's voice, when it came, was smaller than Calvin had ever heard it. Calvin, I didn't know, he said. Not unkindly, not sharply, just factually. The way you say the word when a thing is simply and completely true. You didn't. He stood and gathered his copies. He thanked Dolores. He shook Hoskins's hand, which surprised Hoskins enough that he shook it back before he had time to decide not to. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. At the door he stopped. He did not turn around. I hope you find what you're looking for, Simone, he said. I genuinely do. He walked out. He drove home in the Silverado with the windows down despite the December cold, because the cold was real and present and felt honest, and he had had enough of surfaces that performed as something they were not. Some things, he thought, could not be recovered once they were dismantled by the wrong hands. He was not one of them. 3 months later, 3 months after the meeting, 6 months after she had set her key on the kitchen counter, she came to the door. It was a Sunday. Early March. Calvin had been in the workshop since 7, working a set of custom, built-in shelves for a client in Midtown who wanted white oak to match the floors she had inherited from her grandmother. The light was coming in right. He was in the middle of a finish pass when he heard the bell. He knew before he answered it. She was standing on the porch in the same charcoal coat, her hands pressed together at the front of it, the way she held them when she was unsure of herself. Her eyes were red. Her mascara had tracked a thin line down one cheek that she had not wiped away, which told him she had been crying in the car and had stopped herself before she knocked and had not entirely succeeded. She said his name. She said she had made a mistake. She said Derek was not what she thought. She said she had been wrong about Calvin, about what he was, about what they had. She said she'd been staying with her sister in Germantown since January. She said she missed her home. He listened to all of it. He let her finish. Then he said, with the same quiet evenness he had maintained through every part of this, through the receipts, through the odometer readings, through the conference room, through all of it, he said, the divorce was finalized 11 days ago. The house transferred to the holding company as it was always going to. There's nothing here to come back to. He was not cold when he said it. He was not cruel. He was just done. She started to cry again, fully this time, without composing herself first. And he waited until she had, and then he said, I hope you're all right, Simone. I mean that. I hope you land somewhere good. She left. He went back to the workshop. He picked up the hand plane, his grandfather's, the one that still shot straight after all these years. And he found his place on the white oak panel, and he resumed the pass he had been in the middle of. The grain was clear. The light was right. He had built everything worth keeping, and he was exactly where he was supposed to be. 5 months after that, a woman named Naomi came into his professional life through a referral, a structural contractor who had worked with Calvin on a commercial renovation in Cooper Young, and told Naomi, when she asked who had done the millwork, that Calvin Reeves was the person you called when you needed something done right the first time. She was an architect with a practice in Midtown, and she had a project in mind for her own home that required someone who understood how old materials wanted to be treated. They met on a Thursday to walk the space. She asked good questions, the kind that came from someone who had thought about the problem before arriving, not just hoping to be impressed. He appreciated that more than he said. 6 months after their first meeting, she was sitting on the back porch of a house Calvin had begun renovating in the Binghamton neighborhood, a mid-century craftsman with original hardwood under 3 layers of flooring that he had uncovered on a Saturday in September, like a man reading a sentence he had been working toward for years. She had a glass of iced tea. He had coffee. The evening was warm enough to sit outside, and they sat outside, and they didn't need to fill the silence with anything, because the silence was already full. The Memphis Real Estate Investment Company had closed on its 5th property in February, a mixed-use building in the Edge District, whose renovation Calvin had personally overseen through January. The combined portfolio now appraised at just over $1.1 million. He had mentioned this to no one in particular. Dolores Bright had sent him a brief email after the final filings were complete. Everything held. You built it right. He had printed it and folded it once and placed it in the top drawer of his workshop bench, next to his grandfather's handplane. He had heard, through the kind of information that moves through communities without anyone intending to carry it, that Simone was working at a medical billing office in Germantown and had been staying with her sister for the better part of a year. He registered this without satisfaction, without pleasure, without the complicated weight that comes from wanting someone to suffer. He hoped she was okay. He had always meant that. Bitterness required ongoing emotional investment in people who no longer deserved it. Calvin Reeves had never had the time. He was on the porch in the early March light the following spring, pressing seeds into a raised planter he had built from cedar offcuts in the fall. Tomatoes, oregano, a small bay laurel that would need more patience than the season usually offered. When he thought about what his grandfather had said, about the wood knowing what it wanted to be, about the job being to get out of its way, he thought he understood it better now than he had at 9 years old, better even than he had understood it last year. You didn't force it. You prepared. You paid attention. You did the work without announcement. And then the thing you had built became visible all at once to everyone who had decided too quickly that there was nothing there to see. He was free. He was solvent. He was unbothered. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.